Okay, welcome once again to Dr. Campbell's second presentation. I'm Gary Benton, and I'd like to welcome you. If you came yesterday, you heard my previous introduction, so I won't go into quite as much detail this time. Just as a little background, my wife, Tammy, and I have felt really impressed over the years, and especially recently, to encourage and educate people who are looking for better health. Those who would be interested in getting a DVD or CD of this, or CDs or DVDs of this event, can go to bentonhealthpromotions.com, and they will be available there. And also our cookbook, as you've probably seen out in the lobby. If you don't have access to the internet and you would like to, or you're interested in getting the DVDs so you can share them with friends or family, we have a sign-up sheet in the back that you can sign up for. When I was a teenager, I was rafting down a river with a family, and as I looked up ahead, I could see some ripples, and as I looked closer, I could see a steel bar sticking out of the water, just a few inches out of the water. And I yelled to the father who was manning the other paddle and said, "There's a steel bar sticking out of the water. Let's turn the raft sideways and paddle for all we're worth." The father said, "Oh, we don't need to turn very much." And of course, he was much older than me, and this was frightening to me and frustrating because I sensed that just a small change in direction wouldn't be enough. And sure enough, we hit the rod. It made a gash in the bottom of the rubber raft floor, and we were able, with quite a bit of difficulty, to scramble back to shore, and that was the end of our raft trip. When I was about 20 years old, I realized that my health was not good, and I realized that to make a change, I was going to have to turn sideways and paddle. And I started doing that, but it was very difficult, not having much education, not knowing what direction to go. I'm really thankful that Dr. Campbell is here to speak to us, because the research that he has uncovered can help us, give us a shortcut to knowing how to be in better health without so many years of struggling. We'd like to give special thanks to Coffee Communications for their generous support of these programs. Also, Blue Mountain Television for videoing and for promoting these programs. It's been an immense privilege to get to know Dr. Campbell. In my opinion, he's one of the giants in the scientific community, and yet he's as humble and caring as they come. Dr. Campbell has my highest admiration because he has been willing to tell the truth in circles where his message has not been very popular sometimes. I'd like to read a short quote from an author that many of you are familiar with. "The greatest want of the world is men who will not be bought or sold, men who in their inmost souls are true and honest, men whose conscience is as true to duty as the needle to the pole, men who will stand for right though the heavens fall." I believe Dr. Campbell is one of those kind of men, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. T. Colin Campbell to our stage again. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Gary, for that second extremely warm welcome. I very much appreciate that, and I also appreciate all of you coming around again to this lecture. And for any of you who haven't been here before, I want to say once again, because I feel very strongly, my wife and I do that, I want to thank Gary and and Gary and Tammy, in fact, for their hospitality, and for Gary for his invitation, and his friends for sharing their home with us while we've been here. Yesterday, I sort of gave an overview, as you know. I'm just curious, how many people are here today who were not here yesterday? Oh, there's quite a few. Well, I had to make a choice, by the way. I mean, some of you, of course, heard the lecture yesterday, and I want to talk about sort of a continuum of that today. And so I really can't go back and sort of do what I did yesterday and then sort of also do the new too. So what I would suggest is that I think there has been a DVD, I believe, made of this lecture. And so for those of you who didn't hear the first lecture, in order to understand better what I'm talking about today, I really would suggest you're taking a look at that first. I hope, therefore, what I'm going to be talking about today makes some sense, even for those of you who have not, in fact, heard the first lecture or have not read the book. A second way to do it, by the way, is read the book. So, or get the DVD. Just to put it in a nutshell, as you know, I spent a long career in experimental research, as well as in policy making, which also was quite an education over a period of about 20 years, helping to write national and international diet and health policy. And of course, I've lectured a lot over the years, and I really owe a lot to my colleagues, especially to my students who have worked with me through the years and to produce this kind of information. The bottom line is that I've come to believe something about nutrition that I didn't know when I started. My views today of nutrition are very different than what they were in the beginning when I came off a dairy farm, milking cows and going to school trying to figure out how to produce more cows so we could eat more protein, more animal-based protein. And so I've shifted quite a bit, to say the least. I'm talking now, after all these years, and acquiring a lot of information along the way, sharing a lot of ideas with colleagues and so forth. I've come to this view that we now have a view of nutrition that could be extremely helpful in so many different ways for personal health, public health, societal health, environmental health, all the rest. So today, this lecture, I've sort of divided up a bit. I want to talk just about a couple of the issues, or 2, 3, 4 issues, I guess, elaborate on some of the issues that I had talked about yesterday, kind of glided over. And these issues are things, in one case at least, that unfortunately have been somewhat misunderstood from the book title. And this is quite important. Obviously, I've been in science, and so science is where my home is, and I can talk about science until the cows come home, by the way. And I enjoy science, I like science. But I also know that for those who haven't been in science, it can be quite a task, maybe to understand some of the scientific literature. And I know a lot of people want me just to tell it like it is. You know, just give quick answers, tell you how to do it, get on with your life, kind of thing, which is fine. I mean, I know that's essential. But I have actually come to get my enthusiasm because I've learned a great deal about what the really fundamental biology is and what the so-called empirical data really are that have been published. And so that's where I get my enthusiasm from. And if I just sort of shortcut that, jump to the end and say, okay, then I don't think that kind of information stands apart from other people saying things too. So I do want to kind of jump through a little bit of the science, and I apologize. Hope I can make it clear to you and without labor and creating too much labor. I thought I'd start first, incidentally, by just showing you a picture of the 4 of us, actually 3 of us in this case, who, together with another colleague who's not here, who actually got involved in developing the China project at the time. And as I mentioned, this was the first project that actually was jointly funded by China and the United States after our 2 countries started to talk to each other back in the early 80s. Sir Richard Peto, on your left, was and still is an extremely distinguished biostatistician and epidemiologist at the University of Oxford, where I've also spent time and held a position there myself. The second person, I don't know who it is. The third person is a former student of mine, head of nutrition group in Taiwan. And she was not, in fact, part of the so-called China study, but the China study has since been extended to include not only a resurvey of the people in China that we surveyed the first time, but also has been extended to Taiwan. So this is, in fact, the first project that was jointly done between mainland China and Taiwan. And for those of you who know that history and some of the politics, that was quite an achievement. Dr. Chen Zhou, we say on the Chinese side, is the man who was in my laboratory, as I mentioned yesterday, for about a year, and went back to China. He's a very distinguished fellow, and he's the one who actually headed up the survey teams in China to collect the data. And we've had a close relationship over the years. We're almost like brothers, and that's why we look like each other, by the way. Okay, so for a summary of the evidence on the China study, which we originally called the China Project, the China study, as opposed to project, the China study sort of took on a name because that's the way the book got named. I should mention this up front. When we did the book, we had some difficulty. My youngest son, who wrote the book with me, we had some difficulty at the time of sort of getting a really highfalutin publisher, if you will. It was new for me. I mean, I've published a lot of stuff in science, but not for the public. And so the big publishers, they had a prescription for us to follow in order to write a so-called diet book. And I said, this is not a diet book. But they nonetheless insisted we had to do it their way. And I said, I'm not going to do it your way. So we ended up going to a smaller publisher who was a little bit worried about the fact that the book might not sell. And so in order for him to take a risk and allow us to do it the way we wanted to do it, he retained the right to give it a title. And he gave this title, The China Study, because he said there was already some acknowledgement in the public about this particular project. And if he named it the China Study, it would probably capture at least enough buyers that he could recover his costs. We had given him 200 selected titles to choose from, and we did not give him the China Study. So he said, I can blame it on him, and so that's what I'm doing. Actually, the name of the book was misleading, and just as I thought in the beginning, because a lot of people sort of get the book and say, oh, that's the study that proved everything. Well, it didn't, as many of you know the book. I mean, the China Study occupies one of the 18 chapters. Admittedly, it's a significant chapter. It's one of the bigger ones. But it wasn't everything. It was what I had learned before the China Study and what I subsequently learned after the China Study and what I particularly learned in the policy arena that made the China Study opportunity so rich and so unique and so interesting. But in any case, so this word China Study refers to the title of the book, not only just from the data obtained in the China Study. And as you can see, for optimal health, most of the statistically significant findings, of which there were about 8,000 to 9,000, altogether about 100,000 so-called correlations that we had. But in any case, a huge collection of data, that these findings favored the consumption of whole plant-based foods over animal-based foods, which was in accord or agreed with what, in fact, we had done previous to the study. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is really important, and I hope we can get through this here so it has some meaning to you. Prior to the China Study, this is the kind of information that existed. And it was published by my late friend, Ken Carroll, Professor Ken Carroll at the University of Western Ontario, a real contributor to science through his life. And what he found in the 70s was very similar to what others had been finding for the previous decades before that. Namely, that if you compared some kind of dietary situation with some kind of disease outcome, such as breast cancer in this case, or colon cancer or heart disease, one of the things that really stood out when you compared different countries was that the higher the total fat intake, the higher the dietary fat in the diet, the greater was the risk for diseases like breast cancer. and as I said, colon cancer and heart disease. Those are the three key ones. That, incidentally, is a that's a very impressive relationship here, and suggests that, you know, there could be something here, but I must emphasize, this does not prove, it does not prove that dietary fat causes breast cancer. It simply indicates an association, because countries consuming more high dietary fat are going to be doing a lot of things, you know, that sort of go along with this. So it doesn't prove it. That's point number one. So hopefully that'll clarify it. But anyhow, the information is sort of focused on dietary fat. And it was this chart and this chart here was probably shown more than any other single chart in medicine, I think, for 20 or 30 years, and was actually the basis for, in large measure, for why you heard, and we all heard, some 20 to 30 years ago, to consume low-fat foods, such as skim milk and lean cuts of meat and things like that. And so there was a lot of emphasis put on fat alone as a cause of disease, which was a mistake. It was wrong. And if you recall from my comments yesterday, I say it's a mistake because science likes to focus on one thing at a time. And we do that at great risk, and we make a lot of mistakes when we do that. We have to think about things comprehensively, and that's what I was trying to illustrate to you yesterday, rather than thinking about one thing. For example, let's look at this chart again. I've gone back and actually looked at Ken Carroll's data myself to find out, you know, why did so much emphasis be given to this? Because this was in part the basis too for some of the thinking that we did when we got in the China study. If you look at this line here, I drew that line. That wasn't his line. It's a so-called regression line. If you look at that and sort of get a little bit technical about it and a little more precise, you'll find that line, as it comes down to the bottom line, the x-axis, it crosses before it gets to the origin. What this says is a couple things. Breast cancer is almost non-existent in some societies. Almost non-existent in some societies. And that's one thing it says. The other thing it says that if you take it literally, people actually can consume up to a certain level of fat in the diet and not experience a risk of breast cancer, you know, if assuming that breast cancer and fat are related. So it sort of says, let's take it a step further. It says that we can consume some fat, and I must tell you that we have to consume some fat. It's really essential. There's a certain minimum amount of fat we must consume, but we can get it from food, of course. That's going to the other end of the argument. So what this says here is that we can consume some fat in a diet, you know, if it's coming from food. And so what this is tended to illustrate, as we consume more fat above that minimal level, we tend to get that fat in large measure, at least according to this information, we get it from animal foods. We get it from animal foods. That's really what primarily contributes to fat when you compare different countries. That's not true here in this country, by the way, necessarily. It is in part. It is in part. But we add a lot of fat. We fry things, which we shouldn't do. We fry things in fat. And we put dollops, you know, cupfuls almost of some people do of salad dressings on what otherwise could be good food. And so we're adding a lot of fat that way, and it's one of the reasons we do, in fact, consume high-fat diets. Well, in any case, this was a very much of an influence on our thinking in the last 20, 30, 40 years in the public as well as the scientific community, and it was focused on fat. Okay? Now, let's explore that. And why did I say that there was a problem? Notice here, I called that a threshold. In other words, a threshold meaning you can consume up to a certain amount of fat before you get breast cancer, okay? I went back and actually got some of Ken Carroll's original data and to try to understand this a little bit better. And this chart shows that if you compare just the consumption of plant fat in different countries of the world with breast cancer, you see no relationship. Just kind of random, scattered. There's nothing there to see that you can take home and talk about. So no relationship, okay? So then, in contrast, if you just look at animal fat, look at that one. That's really impressive. There's a big difference between plant fat and animal fat. And you say, oh, okay, I'm not going to ever consume animal fat again, if you want to believe this. But, you know, that's too narrow. But let me sort of shift your thinking a little bit here. That line goes right through the origin. And what does that say, if you take it literally? It says that as soon as you add any animal fat in the diet, breast cancer has an opportunity for being increased. So what does this tell us? This slide and last slide sort of tell us maybe it's not animal fat that's causing this, since I argue, it's much more than that. Maybe it's not just animal fat or plant fat, as the case may be. It's something about plant foods and animal foods. It is a bigger story. And what it's saying here that any kind of animal food, any amount, might be problematic. As you know, I talked yesterday about protein. That's the thing that's kind of looming in the background that people didn't tend to want to talk about. Yes, no threshold, we say. Okay, so there you have it. There's really what it should have been. Animal-based foods has a strong relationship to breast cancer, as it does for heart disease, as it does for colon cancer, as it does for a lot of the so-called Western diseases. And animal food has more than fat, as I said before. It has everything. So what is the consequence of this really narrow-minded thinking? The consequence of it is serious, and they've been a source of confusion. And yesterday I mentioned to you that most everyone would agree that the information in this area involving nutrition has been very confusing if you read the newspapers over the years. So what do I mean by being confusing? Just before I answer that question, let me show you this here for a moment. This is the same chart I just showed you, total fat and breast cancer, as you can see. And you can see up in the right-hand quadrant, all the studies have been done on dietary fat and breast cancer in those early days and much since have actually been done on Western populations up in that quadrant, that square up in the upper right-hand corner. And that's what basically led to some ideas that, fat was related to breast cancer. Our China study, which is one of the things that made it so unique, it was the first study that had an opportunity to come down and look in this bottom area. And so what we were doing in this case was to see if the factors that caused the increase in disease at the higher end of that line were the same factors causing to rise the lower end of that line. And if we could show that, and we did, if we could show that, then all of a sudden this whole line really becomes much more impressive and exciting to consider. So, as I said, focus on fat alone was a mistake, and here's how it became a mistake. When the China study, this is before the China study, let me back up. When the Ken Carroll studies were published in the 1970s, created a lot of stir in the scientific medical community. At that time, the National Academy of Science convened a panel of 13 people who were said to be experts in the field at the time, convened a panel in 1980 to go back and look what was the relationship between diet and cancer. I was one of the 13 people and became one of the authors of that report. And we were the first ones to conclude that we should cut fat intake down to 30% from the usually high 35 to 40%. We also said eat fruits and vegetables and stuff like that on the basis of the information we had at the time. That report became very widely publicized, by the way. I actually gave testimony before congressional committees and was on the McNeil-Lehrer show and all kinds of stuff like that. That sort of popularized, in a sense, this idea that diet was related to cancer. However, at that time, a friend of mine, young guy, at Harvard, decided to do this so-called Nurses' Health Study. How many of you have heard of the Nurses' Health Study? He started the Nurses' Health Study, and and this is about 80 or 90,000 nurses that he was going to follow over some years to see what relationship existed between their dietary habits and their risk of getting diseases, especially breast cancer. And so we talked quite a bit about it. He wanted to focus his study on the idea that if you took fat out of the diet alone, low-fat foods, you would see a reduction in breast cancer. I have to say I warned him against that. That wasn't what we meant. But that's what the public thought, and that's what a lot of people thought. You could just take fat out of the diet and you could get some benefits. Well, after some years, first after 4 years, 8 years, and eventually after 14 years of doing that study, this is the relationship he got. Yes, women were able to decrease their fat intake from something even higher than 49% all the way down to something lower than 29%, and you can see there's no relationship. When the results of this study was published, at the cost of $120 million, I should tell you, and when a second study called the Women's Health Initiative, that was started at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, involved about 36 universities around the country, when they started something similar, not exactly, but they started something similar, focused again on fat, at the cost of more than $1 billion. I mean, these two studies are huge. When they started these studies, they focused their so-called hypothesis just on fat alone. And I, as I say, I was invited to speak to both groups prior to starting the study and give my opinion, but because I was an author of the report in the National Academy of Science, for one thing, and I was really concerned that they were going down a track they shouldn't go down. But the reason they were doing that, because that's what everybody wanted to think. They're thinking it's a very reductionist way. You know, we've just found one thing. If we just take this out of the food, or we eliminate it, or something like that, you know, we can get good benefits. And that's the reductionist thing that I tried to explain yesterday that really is wrong. Change it one thing at a time. So these nurses here, even though they decrease fat, and you know how they decrease fat, by the way? You start using skim milk or low-fat milk instead of whole milk or low-fat dairy products. And they started using, in some cases, the women who were more serious about it, you know, obviously were cutting down on their use of oils and fried foods and, you know, not as much in salad dressings and so forth and so on. So they were able to decrease their fat. But what happened when they did that? As they decreased their fat, they were told to increase their consumption of fruits and vegetables and grains, yes. But most people didn't listen. They didn't change their consumption of fruits and vegetables and grains. It stayed low for all those people all that time. It's overall quite low in this country. They stayed pretty low. So they cut down their fat. Yeah, they did that and did it quite nicely. And that looks like a lot. But as the fat went down, their consumption of animal-based foods went up because they were consuming skim milk, lean cuts of meat, and things like that. And so the already high intake of animal protein at the beginning of the study actually went even higher at the end of the study. And these nurses in this study have, in fact, finally got to a level where they were consuming animal protein at really high levels, in my view. And as animal protein tends to go up, not a lot in absolute terms, but it went up in relative terms, it went up quite a bit. That any effect of fat on decreasing breast cancer would have been eliminated because animal protein would have increased it. And that's exactly what has happened here. And what this comes to is this. Many of the studies that have done in humans over the years, done in Western populations, have actually been including in the study people who more or less are continuing to eat the good old American diet. High in protein, high in fat, high in animal foods, not enough vegetables. And when they're at that level, and they just change one thing at a time, forget it. It's not going to work. In other words, what this is telling us, especially in retrospect, if you want to really achieve real benefits, you know, in this kind of message, you kind of have to really shift from the kind of foods you actually choose to eat. And it's one of the arguments, in fact, today that I find quite persuasive, you know, to really go over to the plant-based foods, and then in turn, followed up, don't add back a lot of fat. Don't use fried foods. You know, cut down on total oil and fats as what you otherwise should and would. And just use the plant foods themselves. There's some nice ways of preparing these foods. Some people, the chefs and all, really do an excellent job of doing that. And when we get down to eating plant foods, less fat, which incidentally, you know, the taste for fat, the preference for fatty foods is an adaptive thing, as many of you may know. And so over time, you start eating high fat, you become more and more sort of like that over the years, and you get to a point where you think that's the only kind of food you really find tasty. Well, of course, I mean, you become addicted to it. And so suddenly then you come down to a low-fat thing, and at first you think, oh, I'm not going to eat that old rabbit food. You know, it doesn't have any. But the thing is that if you're at a high-fat diet, now you want to make a change, one of the things that has to be remembered, okay, give yourself a little time. Because we can actually, what I use the word de-adapt. You can become accustomed to this new thing. Your body changes. It may take a few months in some cases, but when you finally get to becoming accustomed to using low-fat foods, then at that particular point in time, you kind of look back, say, you know, why did I eat that high-fat food in the first place? So taste change, and it's one way to get away from one of the difficulties of consuming this high-fat food. The same argument, incidentally, can be made for salt, especially prominent in salt. We become accustomed to consuming higher and higher and higher levels of salt, and all of a sudden we stop using salt, and it's bland. We don't like it. You know, it's just the way it is. It's the way the human body is. But if you give yourself about a month or a little more, a little patience, a little persistence, you get to a point where you can all of a sudden discover that low-salt, low-fat diets are not so bad after all. You can discover new tastes too, and you get healthier. So all of that. Anyhow, this is, I like to use this example because this study and the other one have cost so much money. And they have published a lot of information that's come out in the public. And I have to tell you, if you want to look carefully, I'm sorry to have to be so critical of some of my colleagues about this way, but this is the way the study is. If you look at the results of those studies, they're very confusing. One day, eggs are in. Another day, eggs are out. One day, fish is in. Another day, is out. I mean, you get a lot of confusing things when everybody's doing anything wrong. It's sort of like this. If you take a bunch of smokers consuming 3 or 4 packs a day, and you're going to study them to see what effect, you know, decrease in smoking had on their response, if they just cut down, let's say, half a pack a day, you know, from 4 down to 3.5 or 3.5 down to 3 or something, and then you study them, can you imagine really seeing anything of any significance? Not really. If you see anything and it kind of pops up as just an odd thing, I mean, you really have to get the benefits of doing the right thing, you have to do the right thing. And you can't go just a little part of the way and hope to achieve too much. So anyhow, this is what led to a more comprehensive view of things as far as I was concerned. This whole fat argument, discussion, you know, really got off on a tangent someplace. And oh, one more thing. When the recent results of the Nurses' Health Study was published and said, fat not related to breast cancer, a lot of people were up in arms because that comment came back, especially when it got publicized, as, oh, there's no relationship between diet and cancer, after all. Well, that was exactly the damage that was done. Because from the very beginning, it wasn't about fat alone. But in the process, those who are opposed to the argument about diet being related to disease loved this result because, oh, this just proves, you know, you cut down fat intake, you're not going to achieve anything. Well, of course you don't achieve anything. And actually, I have to tell you, I'm kind of exercised about this because when those results came out, they do get a lot of publicity. The New York Times, for example, front page, right up in the headlines when it came out last spring, the final results. It says, it's fat not related to breast cancer. Big Harvard study showed, you know, and everyone said, what is going on here? And basically, it was designed wrongly in the first place. The right result was got for the wrong reason. I mean, so it just didn't make sense. To go back to the China study just a moment, the China study, of course, that was one of the reasons we wanted to look very comprehensively. And here's one way. I'm going to show you just a few things about looking at really complex kinds of data. We had information on all kinds of diseases in China. And I wanted just to see if there was any sort of particular, as we say, aggregation of diseases together. Do some diseases tend to occur in the similar regions of the country compared to other diseases? And I can't explain all the details of this, but I just made a big chart and put all of them down and see how they were correlated with each other and so forth and so on. And without getting, as I say, into the details of this, it turns out that there were 2 sort of disease types that are clustered together. One of them are known as diseases of poverty, sort of poor countries, the other diseases of affluence. And so what this says is that not only do each of these groups of disease sort of tend to occur in the same regions, this suggests, too, that they share common causes. So then you can ask the question. You create an index for each of these different groups, and you ask the question, what's the common causes of these 2 groups of diseases? And it turns out the answer in large part, is indicated by the amount of blood cholesterol a person has. And in China, their blood cholesterol levels were very low. They ranged from a low of 90 to 170. These are averages for different villages. That's pretty low. The average is 127. In fact, that was so startling at the time, made some news, that I was a little concerned that maybe, our analysis wasn't good enough, so we analyzed another 2 times, different methods, different labs, and that's the result we got. Their cholesterol levels, their high was near our low, as you can see. Their high was near our low. And we already knew in the Western literature that higher cholesterol levels mean more heart disease. Well, in China, in our study, higher cholesterol levels going from 90 up to 170 also showed an increase in cancers too, including breast cancer. And cholesterol is an indication of diet. Cholesterol is a large indication of diet, and it's an indication of consuming animal-based foods and a decrease in plant-based foods for multiple different reasons, by the way. But in any case, it's a really good sort of window or indicator, biomarker, we can call it, of the risk of not just heart disease, but the risk of cancer. It sort of goes together. I mean, I'm getting a little bit technical on you here, but correlations are indicated by these numbers you can see on the right-hand side, 0.48 and 0.41 or whatever. And what this shows here, those diseases of affluence. See, I'm suggesting these Western diseases might have some common causes. It turns out they're highly correlated with cholesterol levels, I just said. They're also correlated with plasma urea nitrogen. You may not know what that means, but that's really an indication of animal foods. And this is one of the reasons that the China study became so unique and interesting, was because of its association with blood cholesterol, which in turn was associated with, as you can see here, let's just look at the top line. We won't talk about cholesterol. It's positively associated with animal protein inversely. That minus means the other way. As cholesterol goes up, it goes up in response to consuming more animal foods. It also goes up when you consume less plant foods. So it's really worked out pretty nicely. And I don't want to get into too many of the details there. So this is just one indication. I'm trying to share with you some of the kind of analysis, however the technical they may be, that really are very, very exciting and impressive in a sense. This being, of course, with cholesterol. And so you can see here, plasma cholesterol is positively associated with breast and most cancer mortality rates. So this is, as I say, cholesterol tends to go up when you consume animal foods. Incidentally, your doctor may have told you, or doctors, I should say, doctors have been saying for years that cholesterol goes up when you consume saturated fat or when you consume cholesterol. Neither one of those things have that much to do with it. It has some. It's really consuming animal-based foods that cause the cholesterol to go up. What does that mean? It means, again, if you're consuming a diet high in animal foods, you take out the fat, you're using lean cuts of dairy, and you're doing this and that, you cut down fat intake, you're going to get some decrease in cholesterol levels, yes, your blood cholesterol, but if you really want to go the whole way, you've got to drop the dairy too. You've got to drop the animal protein products in order to get to where you really, really should be. So that's one way, talking about complex data, that means a lot, I think. Here's another way. We actually, as I said, we had 100,000 correlations, 8 or 9,000 or so were significant. And so we wanted to sort of assemble these correlations in meaningful ways. You cluster them together and you can ask questions. What's the probability this stuff goes together? And here, these are a bunch of lists of them. I won't go into them here. But to look at the top 3, we could compare breast cancer and dietary fat. And it turned out as fat goes up from a low of 6 to 24, it's already low. As it goes up, breast cancer tends to go up. Also, estrogen, women's hormones, female hormones, the higher the level of hormones in the blood, the higher the breast cancer. Agent menarche, that's an interesting one. You might not know. Agent menarche, I think all of you know what that means when a young woman is reaching a reproductive age, of course. We have lots of studies that show the earlier the age at menarche, the greater the risk for breast cancer later in life. Early age, more breast cancer. Okay? That's been shown many times. In China, and in this country, the average age of menarche is about 11, 12 years or so. The average age of menarche in our Chinese cohort was 17 years. 17 years. That's a big difference. That's a huge difference. And the age of men actually tends to occur, we already know this too, it tends to occur according to the rate of the child growing. That is, if you push children, and we do this in our society, we want to grow them as fast as we can. And one of the ways to grow them as fast as we can, make sure they drink that glass of milk, and grow fast. And so they grow fast, they eat lots of meat, and when they grow fast, they reach their sexual maturation earlier in life. By some number of years, in fact, it would appear to be. And so then they end up, when they reach the age of menarche, then the levels of estrogen sort of surge, and they remain high during the reproductive years. And so you got everything sort of going wrong. So here's 3 different things you can look at from a complex set of data, and you say, well, what are all these things telling us? Do they fit together? And they do. They fit as in this sort of schematic here. Okay. Here's a couple of schematic lines that represent the kind of data that we got in the China study, okay? Look at the bottom, I don't have a pointer here, but look at the bottom sort of line, rural Chinese women. This is, on the bottom here is age, as you can see, and up the other side is the level of estrogen in the blood. So, rural Chinese women start around 17 years, and for a young girl, when she goes into that period of her life, her estrogen levels come up quite substantially. So it comes up and then remains at that level more or less until menopause arises. The Chinese girls start at 17, they end at 48 on average. The American Western woman starts at 11, 12 or so, and ends up around 52. The American woman has a reproductive life about 9 years longer, something, 8, 9 years, something longer than the Asian woman. Why? Because the American girl and the American woman is consuming all this animal food. And they're growing fast. We're pushing them. They're growing as fast as they can. And this is particularly true for dairy. Dairy will tend to do that, increase the rate at which this occurs. And so the Western women, as you can see, they start earlier. They end up later. And they end up with, we measured all kinds of hormones in the blood of the rural Chinese women and in Western women to compare. It turns out the estrogen levels in American women is higher. So then the question becomes, what's all this telling us? It shows that the American woman, or Western woman, or Western lifestyle, her exposure to estrogen during her lifetime, both in terms of having a longer reproductive life, as well as higher levels of estrogen during that time, as a result, they have total exposure is 4 to 5 times greater. And so is breast cancer 4 to 5 times greater. And we already know that estrogen levels in the blood are strongly related to breast cancer risk. Anything that causes estrogen levels to go higher, stay up there, especially over a prolonged period of time, is going to increase the risk for breast cancer. So then, as a result of that, all of a sudden this makes sense. This is a recent publication showing a relationship between milk consumption and breast cancer. That's as good as it gets. Or as bad as it gets, I guess I could say. Really strong relationship between consumption of dairy and breast cancer. And so too it is also true with uterine cancer. And so too it is also true for prostate cancer in men. So what's operating in women with their reproductive cancers is also operating with men with their reproductive cancer as well. So it tends to respond to this, and this says so much. It says so much. It says that with children, this is the target group where we really need to be careful. Because if we start out children consuming a rich diet, high in animal protein and fat and all that, and really just kind of pumping iron and all the rest of it, that's not good. That's not good. They become accustomed to the taste. They like that food. They're going to find it difficult to get away from it later on because of taste addictions and all the rest of it. And they end up with higher risk for diseases like heart disease, colon cancer, breast cancer, and all the rest of it. Anyhow, that's another way of using the China data. Just sort of, okay, let's take it a little bit here. Let's put it all together and see if it sort of hangs together. If it hangs together, then it can mean something. Expanding the disease horizon. Here's some more. I mentioned some yesterday to you. I showed this group here. We could go through and discuss each one of these. I mean, there's a bunch of different diseases here. Some of them are remarkable. they are increased when they're consuming animal-based foods, decreased when they consume plant-based foods. And some of this information is old. And you remember I said yesterday, why haven't we known this before? Well, I'm going to get into that in my next lecture this evening, more into that. But there's I want to tell you, too, that some of this information has been around a long time, and we just plain ignored it. We chose to ignore it. Here's a study done in 1940 and 41. How many years? 65 years ago? In experimental rabbits. Rabbits are a pretty good model to use to understand the development of heart disease. It's probably the best experimental animal everybody knows in science. It generally is. Their cholesterol levels fluctuate like ours do, and they get, atherogenic or heart disease lesions like we do. Well, here's a study comparing casein, the milk protein, and soy protein in terms of the so-called sclerotic activity. Sclerotic activity means how much sclerosis occurring, how much early lesions were occurring. And you can see the casein, geez, it's 5 times? Wow. 5 times higher. This animal protein is actually creating a much greater risk for the development of these early lesions that can lead to heart disease than does soy, for example. And that's now been shown, incidentally. Thank you. Good. Anyhow, that's been shown, as you can see there, a long time ago, 65 years ago. And incidentally, before I get onto this, do you know when cholesterol was first being seen, blood cholesterol was first being seen related to heart disease, that was first observed in 1909 in Russia. And the first investigators who were looking at this said it was probably animal protein, and they got pushed into the background. That's another whole story. That was a whole story. Eventually, as the years passed, everybody focused on saturated fat and cholesterol in the food instead of focusing on animal protein. There's something about animal protein, I suggested yesterday, it's the history of animal protein has driven the debate. It has affected our brains, our reverence for animal protein through the last 150 years. And in many ways in science, you can see how this has, in fact, sort of polluted the environment to a great extent because we continue to ignore this. Here's just a sort of another example. This was done, published in 1980, which is, 27 years ago now. It's, about 30 years ago, I think. It was being done in Italy and in Holland. And what they showed, let's look at just this bottom line. These 2 lines are basically the same thing, just 2 different groups of people. What they did here is, here's some people, this is time here. What they did, they measured how much cholesterol is in these people at the beginning right there. And they took out the fat, and they gave them a low-fat diet. Remember I said it doesn't work very well? Well, they took the fat out, they decreased the fat, and they got a bit of a decrease, sure enough. I've seen that a few times. But then what they did, from this point, what they got the big decrease is they went away from the animal protein in the diet to plant protein, namely in the form of soy. And look at that big decrease there. In other words, you can't get your cholesterol level down satisfactorily until you actually go to the point of decreasing animal food. End of story. It's that simple. And this fits very well, with the data that had been done before. And when they put the protein back again, you can see, so it comes down here, here. I mean, these are just 2 different groups of people. Some of them start at higher levels of cholesterol than the others. So it comes back. I mean, that was published. And we know, incidentally, a lot about how animal protein actually causes cholesterol levels to increase. Something important. Here's another one that, this is multiple sclerosis. I find this one really, really interesting. Multiple sclerosis is a serious disease. It's a serious disease. There's no question about it. And everybody knows that somebody who has MS, is progressive, and eventually it's more than serious. A man by the name of Roy Swank, Dr. Roy Swank, some years ago, back in the 40s, had made some observations when he was looking at people in Norway. He at the time was in Canada, Montreal Medical School. And he started a study. And he wanted to know whether diet had something to do with MS. And so what he did, he got a bunch of MS patients in the early days together. And he wanted to follow them, just see how their diets might be different. And he divided them over the years into 2 different groups. Those consuming less than 20 grams of so-called saturated fat, and those consuming more than 20 grams of saturated fat. Now, this one here, less saturated fat is primarily found in animal foods, as you know, or you may know. Saturated fat, saturated fat is primarily animal foods, so when they consume less than 20 grams of saturated fat, they're consuming mostly a plant-based diet. So this group is consuming mostly a plant-based or much more orientation to plant foods. This is more animal foods. And they started out at different levels of severity. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 to 5. Some were pretty advanced at that point, and they followed them. And then he published the results in the leading, oldest medical journal in the world, Lancet. It's not this is not just flunky science. This is for real. And so he published this information over the years. The man is now about 98 years old. I think he's here. Yes, he is. He's in Oregon. He's in Oregon, I think in Portland. He really deserves a tremendous accolades for what he did over the years, but a lot of his work was, people poked fun at it in spite of these results and in spite of where it was published. And you can look at these different numbers, 5%, 80%, 35, 66, 21, 83. This is an imperfect study because in this particular case, he's not telling people what to do. He's just kind of letting them do what they do and then sort of seeing what differences might occur as a result of them choosing to eat different kinds of food. Here's what he said in the most recent publication. About 95% of MS patients diagnosed early remained only mildly disabled for about 30 years. That's amazing. That is truly amazing. That diet has such a strong effect on MS. And it's about consuming animal-based foods. Or conversely, not consuming enough plant-based foods. And now we're learning, incidentally, in biochemistry labs, clinical labs, we're learning quite a bit about something about that too. You know, MS is an autoimmune disease. And so we're learning, this should have been told a few decades ago, and it's only just now, maybe coming together, and not really, because if you look at the internet site for MS Society internet sites, professional societies, go in there and see if you can see anything about diet. If you go in there, they'll tell you there's nothing, we don't know anything about diet. It's nonsense. It's just total nonsense. And this result, this is, the point I want to make here is this, like previously. Some of this information has been around for some number of years. And some of it's very impressive. And why is it being ignored? Why is it being ignored? Here's animal protein kidney stones, done by a Scottishman who spent his lifetime just working on kidney stones and all the details of that. And basically what he found was that as you increase animal protein, different sections of the country, as you increase animal protein for some men especially, I think it was all men in this case, they got kidney stones. And when they came in, they were suffering, and I'm sure you know the pain associated with kidney stones. It's horrible. And so he put them on a low animal protein diet to go away. Put it back on and come back again. Striking, absolutely striking. He was a giant in his own right. Thank you. Yeah, water's pretty important, by the way. Thank you. Okay, here's something that's really kind of crazy. Cataracts. Everybody gets cataracts. Oh, not everybody, but most people, a lot of people get cataracts as they get older. It turns out it has a strong relationship to diet, too. Here's just one study. I show this in here because, I forget, this was published about 20 years ago, I think, or so. And it shows a relationship, especially with milk. People consuming more milk. Yeah, there are two different, diabetics, non-diabetics have a differential risk of getting cataracts for some reason. But in any case, set that aside for a minute. I want you just to compare the rate of cataracts over time from 15 to 76 as they consume more dairy. I bet you haven't heard that before. That consuming dairy increases the risk for cataracts. And again, we know quite a bit about that. So here's one more. There's so many of these things that come from that table before that I could tell you about that makes this message, the message being that consuming a plant-based diet is extraordinary. If you do the whole thing, the whole food, I'm not talking about supplements, as I said yesterday, I'm talking about whole food. If you do it the right way, good food, you know, the achievement of health runs across the board. and we can stop forgetting about the details. I think the tyranny is in the details, to be honest about it. Here's something that was kind of interesting, published 1905, 202 years ago, by the head of physiology at Yale University. And I want to show this because this is an area where people often ask questions, and where, again, a whole industry started because they ignored this information. But Dr. Chittenden, Russell Chittenden, was a leading light in his day. He was the head of physiology at the Yale University School of Medicine. He had come from England, very distinguished man. What he wanted to do was to see, in those days, the information on animal protein was just kind of unfolding, and the recommendations for consuming lots of protein were very high, because everybody thought, you got to get a lot of protein. It was the sign of civilization itself. That's actually what one leading researcher said in those days. Eating animal protein was a sign of civilization itself. Really arrogant statement. But in any case, he had some objection to that. So what he did, he tried consuming a plant-based diet, going off animal protein. And he felt better. He felt better, felt more energetic. And he thought he felt stronger, too, more physically capable. So he tried it on himself, a couple of his colleagues, felt better. Of course, that doesn't convince anybody of anything. Oh, you're doing something else, that doesn't matter. So then he organized a study. And so what he did, he got some young students coming into Yale University at the time who were then going into the military training program, the so-called ROTC program, which actually existed in those days. They were going into the ROTC program from their homes. And during the ROTC program, as you know, they got trained physically and every other way. And so over the next 6 months or so, they were beefing it up and getting stronger and more physically fit. And so in the beginning, he put them on 15 different strength and endurance tests, and then sort of assigned a number based on all those different tests to average things out. And so this is a list of all the names of the people. And so they started in October at the beginning of the school year, and they put them on this test, and here was their strength and endurance test number. And now they're consuming, during the next 6, 7 months or so, a low-protein, virtually plant-based diet. And at the end of the time, they get this. And so here's the averages. So, you're consuming plant-based diets, they're getting physically fit. Well, he got criticized for that for good reasons. His colleagues said, oh, that doesn't mean anything. If they had consumed animal-based foods, kept on consuming the same foods that they had been consuming, they'd have done better. This was probably just compromising them. They got fit because they were putting in time to exercise. So he said, okay. So what he did, he organized a study again. He went out and got some already physically fit athletes, to use his words, some of them in the pink of their condition, world-class or all-American athletes, actually. I mean, they were already fit. So he organized that study with these people, and there's the numbers. They started out at 49.15. See, already fit? And all they did after already fit, they switched them to a plant-based diet. Look what happened. So there's a summary. Here's young guys coming in, home food, high in animal foods, getting trained, go to here. Here's some physically fit people, more or less already there, they go to that. That's pretty impressive. That is pretty impressive. And in fact, that had been shown a number of times that physically fit athletes, if someone even can become a world-class athlete by consuming a plant-based diet. And when I was teaching, I organized a course at Cornell some years ago, with this kind of provocative information, I guess you could say. Got a lot of pre-med students and students like that coming, and I think the initial question that most people raised at the time was, well, okay, maybe you had something here, but look, we need protein. We need animal protein for physical fitness. If we're not going to get it from animal protein itself, we're going to take some steroids, which does the same thing, basically, as animal protein. Steroids and animal protein do about the same thing, at the physical level. And so people found it hard to believe that animal protein diets could actually be associated with physical fitness. So I did for my class, I decided to go out and get some world-class athletes where I could find them. maybe some world-class athletes who had in fact become world-class athletes because they were consuming plant-based diets. I got Dave Scott, who was arguably, or according to the television, was probably the world's greatest athlete. He's the guy that won the Ironman triathlon in Hawaii 5 times, I think it was, or something. I mean, the guy was incredible fitness. He was basically consuming a plant-based diet. Came and shared his ideas with me. He stayed at our house, and we live in Ithaca, very steep hills in that town. And he wanted to go for a little jog that morning before class at 11 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I'm going to go for a little run. So he went running down this steep hill. Anyhow, he came back for class, hardly breathing, went to class. I just actually went out and measured, the distance he ran for that short. I mean, I'm talking about hills. If anybody know Ithaca, it's about like that. I mean, he went all the way down, went up the other side, back down, up the other. He went 13.2 miles just for a little jog. And just extremely fit. And so then I got involved in some other world-class athletes, including the captain of the U.S. Olympic team in 1990, a guy who in the 1970s had been the light heavyweight wrestling champion in the Big Ten. He was the champion the last 2 years. And so he wanted to go on to the Olympics in 1980. Married a girl from Syracuse, and she was a dietitian, and so he wanted to see if he could change his diet a little bit, maybe really get fit so he could be ready for the Olympics in 1980, and decided for some reason to start consuming vegetables and fruits and grains and leave it at that. And so he went into the training period before the 1980 Olympics, and he was wrestling in the trials and stuff like that. The last wrestling match he had just before the Olympics, he had beat the guy that got the gold medal in the 1976 Olympics. He beat him 14-2. And he was the shoo-in to get the gold medal. No, all hands down. Well, in 1980, unfortunately, the Americans did not go to the Olympics because Jimmy Carter called them off and because of the Afghanistan thing. So then he was really discouraged, to say the least. He didn't go to the 1984 Olympics either. By this time, it's over for him. I mean, wrestlers have to be, pretty young to get in that Olympic class. He didn't go into 1984. He came back and went to law school, got himself a law degree at Cornell. And 1988 rolled around, well past time now. He didn't go to the Olympics for wrestling then either. And so in 1992, he's feeling so good about things. Well, I'll give it a shot. So he was 39 years old, trained for the Olympics, got on the team, went to the Olympics. He was the captain of the U.S. team, captain of the U.S. Olympic team. And they have runoffs going up, 2 different runoffs. They divide them in half sort of wrestle off against each other, and the other half wrestle off against each other. And then the top 2 in each 2 classes, they wrestle for the top medals, the bronze, the silver, and the gold. In any case, he got a bronze. He just missed by 1 point, beating the guy on the other side who won the gold medal. At 39 years old, he holds a record for the oldest guy to win a major medal in the Olympics, by far. And so then he was appointed to become the director of the U.S. Olympic boxing team, who needed some help. And he was so enthused about all this stuff, he invited me out to speak to the U.S. boxing team because he wanted to get the whole American team to start, eating the right way in order to improve their capabilities in the Olympics. Unfortunately, I went there and I was talking to the boxing team, and 85% of whom were African American or Hispanic. And of all the times I got to teach them, I was talking to those guys at the time that Michael Jordan was playing his very last game. And so as they were having to not watch Michael Jordan, their hero, and listen to me, it didn't work. It wasn't exactly the thing to do. But in any case, I've had some other people. A woman, Ruth Heydrich, you may know her. She got breast cancer when she was about 42, I think it was. It was pretty serious. She was worried about it. She went on a plant-based diet, got more fit. During the 1950s, she was running marathons. She started running marathons. Her breast cancer got solved. And during the 1950s, her bone density, incidentally, increased, believe it or not, of all things. And now she's 71, and I think she's run about 71 marathons. And she recently published a book called Running Around the World. Ruth Heydrich, I had her to come to my class as well. Monica Seles, Martina Navratilova, Carl Moses, the most gold medals of any person in the Olympics. I mean, eating a plant-based diet does not, in fact, make it more difficult to participate in athletics. It's an improvement. As a matter of fact, Dave Scott told our class when he was there, at the time he was consulting with the National Football League, and he said the best kept secret in the NFL in those days was the fact that the guys who consumed all that protein to build muscle mass, the NFL linemen, the average age of death of NFL linemen, according to Dave Scott, was 53 years. So they're paying a price. They're paying a price. So consuming a lot of animal protein, beefing up like that, as they say, or taking steroids, one and the same, they're going to pay a price later in life. So that's the end of my sort of picking up some pieces, developing it a bit. I now want to talk in the next lecture, hope you'll return, about, why don't we know this? And I want to share some ideas that I've come up with, experiences I've had in writing national and international diet and health policy. It's was quite an experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Dr. Campbell has generously agreed to stay for a few minutes to have some questions and answers.
Do you think we'll ever get over the taking the drug for every stupid thing that people get? I mean, it just seems like they come up with more and more.
The question is whether or not we'll ever get over the habit of using drugs for each and every ailment we have. Where's all that going? I guess as I could paraphrase your question a bit. It's going to be difficult. I think it was about a year ago, I saw a report in our local newspaper, and I believe everything in our local newspaper anyhow, but no, this was a report of a survey that was done to the American public as to what they thought about drugs. And it turned out 77% of the public actually believe that taking some kind of drug is the future of our health. I found that number staggering. I guess it's true. Most people think that getting health is going to come from the pharmacist. And what I'm talking about here is food, not drugs. And there's so much more we can accomplish with food rather than relying on drugs. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Why have we become so dependent on drugs to take care of ourselves? It really is, it's a disaster. Yeah.
You talked about, how food affects physical health, but I was just curious as to how it affects mental health.
I think the best example I give that is Dr. Neil Nedley, whom many of you may have heard of his name. He's an Adventist doctor, by the way, living in Ardmore, Oklahoma. Bright young guy, been practicing medicine, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years, something like that. And he got on to, believing this kind of thing on his own, of course, and started practicing with his patients by advising them that he wanted to have them consider diet, not drugs. And it's had enormous success. And one of the things that he noted, especially, was the fact that when people go to the doctor, a lot of people, and he's an internist, as I understand it, when people go to the doctor, something like 40% of the people have signs of clinical depression. Maybe not surprising because they're sick and so forth. But in any case, he found that when he changed their diet over, he had remarkable effects on clinical depression. It really improved a lot. I don't know whether it's because they are kind of fixing up their bodies and therefore they're less likely to get depressed, or whether it's something affecting the brain itself, I'm not sure. But we're seeing, there's a lot of anecdotal information to show that our minds do change. Our mental conditioning, our acuity, our ability to think more clearly, our ability to be more positive, I guess, about life in some ways, is all helped by the food that we choose to eat. Plant-based food really being very helpful in that regard. Yeah.
I have a question. As far as I've had some friends with dealing with cancer and been doing a lot of studying on the internet. And one of the things I've come across is alkaline versus acidic. And I know that the animal protein in the dairy tends to be acidic. Is it possible that some of these cancer research could be based on not so much the protein? I mean, have you looked in plant protein, people who have high plant protein diets like beans or that kind of thing, whether or not that could be related to cancer?
Very much so. Your impressions are correct. A lot of stuff you can't necessarily believe on the internet, but you've been sorting it out pretty well, I think. Yeah, we've known for a long time that animal protein creates more acidity as opposed to plant protein. That was first observed in 1883, by the way. I just happen to know that report. And so we've known that too a long time. And the animal protein has more of the sulfur amino acids in it that when they get metabolized creates the so-called sulfate ion, which is acidic. So we do get a little more acidity by consuming those kinds of foods. And that's one of the reasons that's given for why animal protein is associated with osteoporosis. Because when we create a little more acidity in our bodies, the body doesn't like that and tries to buffer it. And the best way to buffer it is to pull the calcium out of the bones. So therefore, it tends to deplete the calcium from the bones while we're consuming animal protein. Yeah, the acid-base balance is important. It's one of the really fundamental things that's going on, that affects a lot of systems. A little more acid in the body, for example, affects, for example, the enzyme responsible for creating the active form of vitamin D. So it compromises vitamin D status, suggesting people should take vitamin D, to do things. And so, yeah, acid-base balances are the root of a lot of stuff. And it will, in fact, relate, I'm convinced, to risk for cancer and growth of cancer cells. Yes, very, very good observation.
I was just wondering, is there any difference between different kinds of animals, products, like, say, fish versus chicken versus beef?
Yeah, that's a good question, too. When we talk about, let's say we want to do a study, compare a bunch of animal proteins and a bunch of plant proteins as to what they do. Well, there's unlimited numbers of things we can look at as to what they do. We can look at, for example, the effect of all these different proteins on raising cholesterol levels, or the effect on their ability to grow cancer cells, or the ability to do that. I mean, a lot of different things that I'm sure you appreciate. And that kind of research hasn't been done except very spottily. There was one again, this Professor Ken Carroll, the late Ken Carroll did this, where he actually compared a bunch of animal proteins and plant proteins in their ability to increase cholesterol levels. And it turned out all the animal proteins were above all the plant proteins in their ability to increase blood cholesterol levels, including fish protein. So fish protein wasn't that different. It was a little lower compared to some of the other animal proteins, but it was certainly above all the plant proteins in terms of it was associated with higher levels of cholesterol than all the plant proteins. So that's one thing, and of course our own studies, looking at some things too, and some others, like casein compared to soy and wheat. And if you weren't here last night, I was pointing out that animal foods are going to tend to, increase the risk of cancer cells growing. Possibly because the acidity and some other things too. And animal proteins almost across the board will do that. Yes. Okay.
Have you done any research or studies in regard to diseases like Crohn's disease and the relationship with a plant-based diet?
Right. Crohn's disease is generally considered to be an autoimmune disease, essentially. And no, I haven't personally done that kind of experimental research. I've only just noted the literature, talked to some friends who've been involved in it. And the sense that I get and the literature that I see suggests that, being on a plant-based diet is helpful. I know I have some friends that are, they have Crohn's disease. No way, I can't take that fiber because that fiber is going to cause me problems. Well, that's not what the the researchers who actually looked at this over the long term say, not from my reading the literature, a plant-based diet basically helps to attenuate Crohn's disease. In many cases, just solves it, according to some of my medical friends, clinicians who actually do this kind of work. As to why, I don't know. It has some reasons. I don't know, but yeah, the scale is tipped for plant-based foods to do that, in spite of their higher fiber contents. That was a bit of a myth in years past. Yeah.
I was just curious about when you go around traveling and giving your message, what segment of the population do you find is more accepting of this? Is it the younger college students? Is it, who are accepting this the most?
Oh. It's hard to say. I see a lot of young students, getting quite interested in this, especially those going maybe into medical school, which is a hopeful sign. I think older people tend to be more interested in health in general. And their questions are somewhat different, of course. One of their questions is it too late? That's always a question. I say no, absolutely not. It's never too late. And they may not get the same benefits that, let's say, a child would get for the rest of their lifetime, for example. But yeah, we've got evidence to show that, older people can benefit quite substantially. But as far as, where the greatest interest lies, I'm not sure. I can say one thing. This is kind of interesting. You notice I didn't use the word, one of the V words very much, or hardly at all. Vegetarianism, veganism. I don't tend to use those words, by the way. They're kind of loaded terms, and they do bother people, a lot of people. In fact, I was one of those people, too, that also got bothered by those words. I had a vegetarian in my class when I was teaching in the 1980s, and I was teaching a senior level nutritional biochemistry class, a lot of pre-med students in there. And I remember that year I was co-teaching it with the head of the department, and this guy was in the class, and I heard he was a vegetarian. I went and told my friend, I said, we got a vegetarian in the class. I come from this community too that, maybe had some doubts about the kind of things like that. And anyhow, he showed up and he wanted to work in my lab. And so we gave him a job to work in my lab to wash some glassware and things. And then he got interested in running. He started running the local races in town, did well. Eventually ended up on the U.S. Olympic team. And he holds the record for the fastest marathon time on the U.S. Olympics. So I said, so much for my biases. But in any case, vegetarians and vegans, that new term, going the whole way, it's baggage for people, but it's sad that it is. I have to say that. It's really sad. The word vegetarian and vegan, if you will, what the Latin root for that is? Latin root word? Is vegetus, vegetus. You know what the word vegetus means when it was first developed in the 1800s? It means strength of mind and body. So, we all should do some little bit of, be more tolerant if we have biases and prejudices like that. We should be more tolerant of that point of view. But I'd like to use the word plant-based diet to talk about it from that perspective. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Campbell. I have a couple questions. One, I teach a lot of this information, and when I tell people just eat your vegetables and fruit and whole grains, they still ask me what percentage should come from carbohydrate, protein, or fat. And given that what the government tells us is not based on the evidence, what is your recommendation on the percentages, of course, all coming from plant-based? And then a second question is about children. They've always been told that they need so much fat for brain development. And do you have a recommendation on that? Thank you.
I'll talk something about that this evening, the recommendations, if you will. I don't get too caught up in the numbers, of individual nutrients, because I believe that there is a tyranny of details, which I draw that phrase from a book that I read called The Tyranny of Counting. We do get caught up in these numbers. and as if they're sort of very special. And I don't like that. As far as recommendations are concerned and how far to go and what % of the diet and stuff like that, I've become comfortable saying the statement, the closer we get to a plant-based diet, the healthier we're going to be across the board. All ages, all situations involving all health conditions. The closer we get to a plant-based diet. No, but I have to confess that, from the research point of view, I know that there's maybe 5% or so of vegetarian, so here I use that word, but 5% of the people who sort of do supposedly everything right, they have difficulty getting their cholesterol levels down, it doesn't quite go down, or they may still have some weight problems, and we don't know why. But I don't know any evidence that indicates that when people eat a plant-based diet and go the whole way, for example, that they suffer any harm, really. That's an important point. And there's another reason for going the whole way, so to speak, and that is that we allow our taste preferences to change for the good. And then it's like, if you want to quit smoking, do we go down to 4 or 5 cigarettes a day? That doesn't really cure us. But going the whole way allows us to readapt.
And no issues with children and fat?
No. That fat thing about children is, in my view, crazy. We have 5 grandchildren. They all eat this way now. And are very, very athletic and very fit. So that's been taken out of the water a few times over. Yeah.
We'll take 2 more questions, and then that'll be it for today.
I was just curious, there's a lot of fads now with soy protein and a lot of emphasis placed on that, and how much of effect that there is when you actually process the soy, and if it's actually still beneficial to you or not.
I think that may be the most common question I get asked. I was just waiting to ask that question. The issue concerning soy, on one hand, has been argued for some decade or more now, 15 years, I guess, that soy is a really good food, reduces cholesterol levels and so forth and so on. Kind of got caught on. The soy industry has grown as a result of it. They're becoming very active in promoting their product and putting it in all kinds of foods, fake meats and things like that, and make all kinds of tofu that you know about. But then there's been also some echoing of that message coming from the dairy industry. The dairy industry has been at this for, since the 1970s. When I was in the Philippines, in fact, they were at it. Very concerned if people started thinking soy was a good thing, it meant problems for their industry. And so they've been going on the attack for a long time and saying every negative thing they can think about it. And unfortunately, both industries, whether it's soy or dairy, they both send out information that I don't consider to be terribly scientific. So I kind of disregard a lot of stuff that gets in the papers. But we do know something about soy, I think. First off, soy is a great food. The whole soybean is really good, just like other legumes and beans and things like that. No question about it. But I think we are running the risk of consuming too much soy. And there is some evidence that people who are on really high soy diets, they tend to increase their so-called, one of the hormones responsible for growth rate and possibly cancer rate, called insulin-like growth factor. And so I think we can overdo consuming soy. And, we're consuming, and it's maybe because of the processing, maybe because, we're getting protein levels in that case so high that, we might be seeing something that's not exactly what we want. So moderation, I think, is one place where that word can be used in regards to soy.
Dr. Campbell, in early stages of multiple dystrophy, can a plant-based diet reverse or stop the disease?
Gosh, that's a tough question. Multiple muscular dystrophy, I think you said? You said muscular dystrophy, yeah. I don't know that one. I didn't find evidence, and I don't have it on the list. And I've wondered about it myself. I know muscular dystrophy, when it was early studied in actually calves and lambs many, many years ago in the 40s and 50s, it was being studied experimentally in those animals that would get it. Selenium and vitamin E was being shown to have an effect on that. And some of that, those ideas have been tried in humans, you know, making sure they have enough selenium, enough vitamin E. That kind of caught a hold for some years. But I'm not sure that, you know, there's anything really sticking out there at the moment. I don't know. I also haven't done my homework enough in this to really know from the old literature to see if I can find something there that other people have ignored. I don't know. But I'm going to guess, just because I've become so enthusiastic with a plant-based diet, that every time I hear of a new disease, situation coming up, and you start looking, you find some benefits. So that's my guess, but a guess.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for sharing with us. I'm sure Dr. Campbell could be at home enjoying his children and grandchildren, but he's come all the way out here, and he wakes up at, I think, he and his wife 5 or 6 in the morning because they're 3 hours off, and it's not an easy thing, but he is committed to sharing this information, getting it out of the scientific community to the common people like us, and I really appreciate that. Dr. Campbell, I believe, can sign a few books afterwards, and as you know, there's one more meeting at 7 p.m., and we'd love to see you then. So have a great afternoon. Thank you for coming.